The Trump administration announces big trade deals with the European Union and Japan that include 15% baseline tariffs on U.S. imports from those allies, as businesses in other countries scramble with more to come as President Trump's August 1 deadline for reciprocal tariffs nears.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. The White House is pulling out all the superlatives, calling its agreement with Japan landmark, historic, unprecedented. The EU one is described as massive, quote, a fundamental rebalancing the economic relationship between the world's two largest economies. But Alicia, to my eye, the biggest bottom line here on both of these deals is one number, that is 15%. The U.S. is going to impose a 15% across-the-board tariff on imported goods from the EU. That is up from something like 5% on average, less than that in January when President Trump took office. Same number on Japan, 15% on imports there. That is compared to what President Trump had threatened, which was 25%. Alicia, you've looked at the overall terms of these deals. What do you make of them, and what is the Trump administration getting, and what is it giving?
Well, it doesn't seem like the Trump administration is getting very much. But in terms of the deals, I think you're right that the 15% is the most important component. It increases it from the baseline tariff of 10%. So there's now a 15% tariff on both Japan and Europe, versus what was the Liberation Day 10%. Now, what the other countries are agreeing to is essentially, in Japan's case, was to make some $550 billion in U.S. investment. And there's some lack of clarity on what this will involve. Now, President Trump says that the Japanese government will essentially either use loan guarantees or other loans or equity financing from its export and international development banks to finance the Trump administration's chosen investments in the U.S. And this could be semiconductors, factories, or perhaps, critical mineral mines. The Japanese investment banks and the Japanese are saying, well, no, we are not subjecting our investment to the direction of the Trump administration. We still retain control and over how we invest, and they are not going to get 90% of the profits, which is what Trump has been trumpeting. So there's a lot of lack of clarity there, and I would say the same thing about the EU agreement that they just signed. Now Trump is trumpeting that they're going to invest $750 billion in U.S. energy, or buy some $750 billion in U.S. energy, probably mostly diesel and liquefied natural gas, and will invest $600 billion in America. But there's, again, very little details on what this will entail. Is it $600 billion over what duration of time? So there seems to be a lot of window dressing for the Trump administration, claiming we got these huge breakthroughs. But there doesn't really much seem to be a broader reducing of non-tariff barriers that are the administration's big pet peeves. For instance, in terms of Europe, the U.S. and President Trump have long complained about their GMO restrictions and regulations that prevent the export of U.S. corn. Similarly, for their ban on hormone-treated beef, none of that is actually is being addressed in this agreement. Nor Europe's digital regulations, the Digital Market Act or Service Act, that arguably discriminates against U.S. tech companies and imposes all kinds of regulatory burdens. Nor does it address Europe's digital taxes that seek to essentially tax the revenue of our tech companies based on their advertising and other metrics. So it's very unclear what the U.S. is getting in return, and what the other countries, presumably Japan and Europe, are getting in return is that they're getting a lower 15% tariff versus what had been threatened. 15% tariff on their autos versus the 25% sectoral tariff that Trump had imposed. And so this could potentially put them at a modest competitive advantage versus other countries or even U.S. automakers, to the extent that U.S. automakers import cars from Canada and Mexico that are subject to 25%. So there's a small benefit there. But I think that the biggest benefit in both of these deals is both of the countries get to walk back from the brink of a trade war and avoid a further escalation that could damage both of their economies.
Kim, a couple thoughts about these promises of investment. One is that some of these statements make it sound pretty industrial policy-esque, pretty centrally planned. So Trump is saying that these investments by Japan will be made, quote, at my direction. And he said the U.S., quote, will receive 90% of the profits, which is not typically how free marketers think that investments in businesses in other countries ought to operate. The other, to Alicia's point about window dressing, there's something different about the way that Trump is negotiating these. In the past, trade negotiations, my perception is, have been done by negotiators really familiar with the nitty-gritty, and the deal is not signed until the people on the ground figuring out all of these details about which beef is going to be accepted and what the digital service rules are going to be. The deal is not signed until all of that stuff is worked out. And Trump is taking the opposite approach here. It's very high level, and then the details get filled in later. And notably, that kind of thing has happened before. Some of those promises have not been met before. I probably remember 4 or 5 years ago, there was a historic trade deal announced with China. China was committing to buy an additional $200 billion of U.S. exports. And here's the assessment a couple years later by the Peterson Institute for International Economics. An author there says China bought none of the extra $200 billion of U.S. exports in Trump trade deal. And so, Kim, that's part of what makes this hard to evaluate and hard to judge. Is it's very easy for a politician to go out there and say, look, we've got this promise. It's X billion dollars of investment. And voters, the public, you're not really sure whether that's going to pan out until years down the road when that guy might be out of office.
And that's why none of the nitty gritty, as Alicia noted, is in any of these deals. I mean, all the things that really are barriers to U.S. imports that our corporations complain about a lot to Washington, they're not being dealt with. For instance, in the EU trade deal, Alicia mentioned it's not addressing digital taxes. It's not addressing the regulations that are on a lot of U.S. tech companies. It's not addressing these kind of bogus food safety rules that Europe has in place, which is largely done as a protectionist measure to block American products from going into Europe. And the reason why is because these things take a very long time to unravel and to negotiate. It's not so simple. Again, a lot of these are regulations. You as a trade negotiator do not necessarily have the ability, if you're speaking for the EU, to say, hey, I promise we'll get rid of this regulation, because that's up to your member countries. And you can't necessarily commit to that. So often when trade deals are done, they have a framework, the countries work toward that progress. And then there's finally, when some progress has been made, you can actually finish it off, and you've got real changes in export and import regulations and rules, et cetera. None of that's happening here. Instead, we're getting these very broad promises about investment and a promise to buy more of this or that. And some of it too, by the way, I was thinking I would love to have a job as an EU trade negotiator, because I would just say yes to everything Donald Trump asked, because there's no way to enforce any of this in the end, right? Like, why did they stop at $750 billion in energy buys? I would have just said I'd do $1 trillion or $2 trillion, right? Like, make Trump even happier, because the realistic effort, I actually was looking at the numbers here. All of the EU bought about $430 billion worth of energy imports last year, and about $90 billion of that went to the United States. Okay, so to hit $750 billion worth of energy buys in the United States, they'd have to triple the amount they bought next year and then continue at that level for the next 2 years while Donald Trump was in office. That's going to be pretty difficult to do, especially because the United States only sold $165 billion worth of energy exports last year, right? So it's not even clear we have the energy to export that makes up that amount of money. Now, Donald Trump is investing a lot in new leases and trying to unleash the U.S. energy sector. And there's a lot of talk about new LNG export terminals. Maybe those will get going, but we know how long some of this takes. And Europe similarly has certain infrastructure constraints in terms of its ability to import more LNG, et cetera. So not to mention, by the way, the EU doesn't direct any of these investments. Private companies have to make these decisions. So these are kind of odd top line wins to have in a trade deal. But the benefit to everybody is, at the very least, it avoids a very ugly tit for tat trade war, lets everybody steps back from it. And I think, as Alicia was noting, some of this is, I think these countries or the EU are making a bet that this 15% across the board rate is blanket rate is better than some of the sector by sector higher tariffs that had been threatened on some of their different industries. And so they are basically taking the best that they can get and running with it. They're probably also banking too that the courts might in fact still strike down some of these Trump tariffs.
Alicia, you mentioned the auto industry, and that's an interesting wrinkle here, because if Trump is moving the tariffs on the EU and Japan down to 15% across the board, then the argument is that U.S. automakers who have products, parts, maybe vehicles that are half assembled going across the borders into Mexico and coming back into Canada, coming back, that those vehicles might now be at a disadvantage if they're facing higher tariffs. And notably, one of the opponents of this deal now is the United Auto Workers. This is a fascinating statement. It says the UAW has pushed for well-crafted tariffs as a tool to level the playing field, bring back good jobs, and drive investment in American manufacturing. But here is the crux, Alicia. The UAW is deeply angered by the Trump administration's announced trade deal with Japan. What we've seen so far makes one thing clear: American workers are once again being left behind, unquote. And Alicia, part of what I find so interesting about that is how quickly and easily these kinds of protectionist pushes can boomerang on companies, industries, because people go out there and they say, I want protectionism. I want tariffs on my competitors. I want tariffs that make it easier for me to do business. But what they ignore is that everybody else is out there saying the same thing. And at some point down the road, it might come back and the tariff will be on something that harms their business.
Well, so just to clarify, the autos tariffs do exempt U.S. content in Mexico and Canadian cars and parts. What the auto workers are really angry about is that they wanted the tariffs at 25% across the board tariffs in order to force more production back into the U.S. Now, the issue here is that as you point out, that U.S. made cars often rely on Canadian Mexican parts. So in some cases, it may actually still be advantageous for Japan or for autos manufacturers in Japan or South Korea, presumably if the South Korea gets a similar agreement, and the EU to import cars at the 15% tariffs than it would be to actually make them in the U.S. using Canadian and Mexican parts. In many cases, I saw a report that GM's cars, actually some of the models like Silverado, are made up of 70% of Mexico or Canadian parts. And so that doesn't actually accomplish the goal of the UAWs when it advocated for these 25% tariffs. Now, to your broader point about how tariffs can boomerang, you're seeing that all over the economy. For instance, with Cleveland Cliffs, one of the biggest steel manufacturers in the U.S., they pushed for tariffs, the higher tariffs, and they were continue to actually support the 50% sectoral tariffs on steel and aluminum. But ironically, they also have plants. They only have a Canadian subsidiary that is now being harmed by that tariff. And they're complaining about that. Now, what their response is they're petitioning Mark Carney in Canada and the Canadian government to increase tariffs in Canada on foreign steel to provide some protection there, as their plants are being hurt by the U.S. tariffs. Now, this is a zero-sum game, because what will then happen is you protect the Canadian market, well, then that steel is going to go elsewhere. Maybe it'll end up China will end up shipping more steel to Europe, and then they'll just raise their tariff barriers, and everyone ends up worse off. This is what happens when you have tit for tat trade wars, or you have protectionism. It always invariably spirals and ends up increasing costs for everyone.
A related story, Kim, on President Trump's push recently for real cane sugar to be used in Coca-Cola. Trump has been pushing this on Truth Social. Here's one of his tweets, for lack of a better word, from the other day. I have been speaking to Coca-Cola about using real cane sugar in Coke in the United States. They have agreed to do so. Recently, Coca-Cola announced during its earnings call that it was not going to shift to cane sugar from high fructose corn syrup, but it's going to begin rolling out this fall an offering made with U.S. cane sugar. It says this will be a complement. It will add more choice to its product lineup. But Kim, a similar story of protectionist boomerang here. Part of the reason that cane sugar fell out of favor in the United States is because in recent years it has been twice as expensive as the corn syrup. That's according to a report by the Government Accountability Office. There's a complicated system of quotas, tariffs that essentially act as protectionism for sugar growers, mostly, not entirely, but a lot of them are in Florida, Louisiana. And so, again, it's a fascinating place where protectionism has effects that are not predicted and not always liked by those in political power. But boy, once those protections go in place, it is awfully hard to get them off. Once you have an entrenched industry that really cares about that particular policy and is willing to make its voice heard and spend money in elections to keep it.
Yeah, good luck to Cane Coke. That's what I have to say. Because, I mean, as somebody who's lived through the decades of the drama and the stories about Coke messing with its formula and how that all works out, I don't think that they're going to be ditching high fructose corn syrup and the recipe that they have right now. But it's a great point, Kyle, that subsidies and tariffs are never beneficial in the end. They end up protecting, and I think the cane sugar thing is a great example. There are these like kind of cane sugar barons in Florida, et cetera. They're essentially like, I won't say a cartel, but I mean, they are this entity, and they have a lot of lobbying clout, especially among their senators and, and this constituency in DC. And so we end up distorting trade policy to, in theory, help them. Often that does come back to boomerang against them. But the bigger losers are always consumers. And it's why one of my disappointments when Donald Trump was in the first administration, he talked more frequently about having trade deals that were all about getting rid of all tariffs and all subsidies and all protectionism. And one of my disappointments this time around has been more that the talking points have been more about protecting American business at all costs. And the way that too frequently happens is all this jerry-rigging on a sector by sector basis. It's not clear. And when you start to do that, you can end up disadvantaging some parts of the American economy in order to protect other parts of the American economy. And it's just going the wrong direction. The better way to do this, and I was laughing, just a bigger point about all of this investment. I mean, so now we've started a trade war, imposed these punishing tariffs on some of our allies, our closest allies in Europe and in Asia, frustrated and annoyed them. And in return for this, we get some vague promises of investment, which there's no concrete, way of actually enforcing any of that. Might it not have been easier and more productive to have just not stood in the way of Nippon trying to buy U.S. steel earlier this year in terms of Japanese investment? There's an example. Or maybe what if we had actually spent some time in the one big beautiful bill further lowering, the corporate tax rate and other taxes, just to encourage or create a better tax system that also tried to lure in yet more foreign investment? Seems to me that would have been a bigger win-win for all concerned.
The big question now this week is what other trade deals might be unveiled. August 1st, Friday, is the deadline Trump has now set for the imposition of these reciprocal tariffs. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick a couple days ago saying this: no extensions, no more grace periods. They'll go into place. Customs will start collecting the money, and off we go, unquote. But Alicia, real serious numbers and taxes, including 50% on Brazil, where the U.S. gets a lot of coffee from. There's a tax foundation write-up here this week says Trump tariffs will affect nearly 75% of U.S. food imports. That includes not only that coffee, but about $2 billion of bananas, mostly from Guatemala and other Central American countries. Alicia, you've expressed some skepticism that Trump was really going to pull the trigger on these huge reciprocal tariffs. And so, I guess we have to wait to find out. It's not impossible that there could be some Brazil trade deal coming out, and Brazil will be, over the next several years, will be investing $10 bazillion in the United States. I'm not sure what the figure would be, but Alicia, what's your read going into this August 1st deadline?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a Trump always chickens out, but I think they're going to try to find a way to declare victory or some kind of Potemkin trade deals, just like they did with Japan in Europe. In many of these instances, we'll probably see one in South Korea. The question about whether there will be one with Mexico and Canada, that's unclear because many of the administration says, well, it's not really if we raise taxes or raise the tariff on Mexico and Canada, it really won't have effect because we're already agreeing to exempt goods that are already currently exempt under USMCA, and that may be true. Though it will probably hit at least 20% of our imports from both of those countries. Now, you mentioned Brazil. The president is trying to use the 50% tariffs as leverage in kind of a foreign policy negotiation over the prosecution of the Bolsonaro, the former president there. I don't know how successful he's going to be, but to your point, 50% tariffs on Brazilian coffee, sugar, and other things that will probably be felt by consumers. So I don't think he's very eager to do that. He may kind of find some way to walk back again from this brink, especially if Brazil threatens to retaliate. Brazil has been making entreaties to China, and I don't think the administration wants to give it another excuse to cozy up to China. In terms of other potential trade agreements, I don't think we're going to see much higher tariffs than the 15% that he's imposing on Europe, Japan, and now is now mooted for South Korea. I think that's now going to be a baseline, and he's just trying to find some way to save face and say, hey, I got this big trade deal. Look how much they're going to invest in the U.S. And in terms of we're going to get a 15% tariff and we're going to bring in all this money. We're going to bring in all this money for the government, and it's trade peace in our time, so to speak. But no, I don't think he's going to go through with his draconian tariffs.
Kim, one last item worth mentioning. On Thursday, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit is hearing that case against these tariffs under IEEPA, the international emergency law that Trump has declared. The thing that I think is important to note about that is while it would be a victory for free traders and for the plaintiffs in this case, for many businesses that have been paying the tariffs. If the court rules that Trump does not have this power, basically unconstrained power to set whatever tariffs he wants under this emergency law. The thing is that Congress has delegated so much power to the president in so many different laws that I think the result of that would only be Trump going and picking a different tool. I think even if he loses this case, I think we're just going to be hearing a lot more in the coming months then about Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930.
Yeah, it could be very unsettling. Look, I don't really like any of this tariff policy. And I think a lot of these deals are window dressing. But at least, as noted, it allowed all the players to step back from the brink and gave the business community a settled playing field so that they understood where things were going forward. And that uncertainty is very difficult for business. And so there's an element that, even though I'd rather that the tariffs aren't this high, that at least it does provide some uncertainty. The question of this lawsuit and the court's ruling, I think is just mostly important from legal perspective, that they come to the right conclusion in the end, whatever that may be. But it does mean if they were to strike these down, and I think there's reason to believe they will, that it's going to compel Trump to, as you say, reach to different authorities that he has so that he can keep up his posture on this. And they will, a lot of those provisions may not provide the standardization that at least this kind of broad tariff authority that he claimed for himself gave him. So it could lead to a much more again, an area of total uncertainty where business don't know where things stand as he goes back to the drawing board, but also a lot of disparate sort of tariff rates in different areas for different lengths of time.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can send your own trade negotiations to pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.